In the year 1869, on a hilltop overlooking the quiet town of Danvers, Massachusetts, the ground was broken for a structure that would come to symbolize both hope and horror. From a distance, the sprawling Gothic edifice resembled a castle, towering spires stabbing at the sky, long wings stretching like arms across the landscape, its very architecture designed to dominate. But within those looming walls, behind windows that seemed to stare out like hollow eyes, a different story was waiting to be written. Danvers State Hospital was envisioned as a beacon of progress, a place where the mentally ill could find treatment, dignity, and a chance at recovery. Instead, it became one of the darkest chapters in America's history of psychiatric care, a labyrinth of nightmares where thousands of souls were lost, silenced, and forgotten. The story of Danvers begins not simply with bricks and mortar, but with an idea, the belief that the human mind, however broken, could be repaired through structure, routine, and compassionate guidance. Reformers of the 19th century, inspired by the so-called moral treatment movement, imagined an institution where order could replace chaos, where science could replace superstition. To achieve this, they needed a hospital unlike any that had come before, vast, isolated, and built according to a radical new philosophy of asylum architecture. Yet even as construction began, shadows were already gathering. For beneath the good intentions lay ignorance, fear, and the willingness to experiment on those least able to resist. From the moment its foundations were laid, Danvers carried an eerie presence. Locals whispered about its hilltop location, once tied to the infamous Salem witch trials, where executions had cast long stains of superstition. It seemed fitting, almost poetic, that a hospital for society's outcasts should rise on such cursed ground. The wind that whipped across the ridges carried an unshakable chill, and as the building took shape, townspeople noted how its silhouette resembled a fortress rather than a sanctuary. Some admired its grandeur, but others felt a foreboding weight, as if the asylum itself was less a hospital and more a prison for the unwanted. The year 1869 marked a turning point in Massachusetts' handling of mental illness. Across the state, overcrowded almshouses and underfunded hospitals struggled to contain growing numbers of the mentally ill. Families unable to cope begged for a solution, and politicians eager to showcase progress found one in the sweeping blueprints of Danvers. The project promised order where there had been chaos, offering an ambitious solution to what was increasingly described as a crisis. The asylum was to be the pride of the state, a demonstration that Massachusetts could lead the nation in modern psychiatric reform. But no blueprint, no reformer's dream, could anticipate the nightmares that would fester inside its walls. For the patients, the story began with fear and uncertainty. Admission meant severing ties with family and community, often permanently. They were led through heavy wooden doors into vast corridors lined with polished brick and iron fixtures. The air was sterile, but beneath it lay something suffocating. For many, Danvers was the last place they would ever see. What awaited them was not sanctuary but an endless routine that blurred the days into indistinguishable stretches of isolation. The hospital quickly gained a reputation as a place where people entered but rarely returned. It was said that the hills swallowed them whole, their identities erased, their cries muffled by stone walls and locked doors. By the time the first patients were admitted, the stage had already been set for tragedy. Designed for just over 500 individuals, Danvers would soon hold thousands. With every bed filled, with cots crammed into hallways and basements, the building itself seemed to groan under the weight of human suffering. Those who visited often described an atmosphere unlike any other, a mixture of despair and silence, broken only by the occasional distant scream or the heavy clang of iron doors. The hospital's architecture, intended to uplift, became a cage. Its massive size and endless corridors overwhelmed patients and staff alike, turning the promise of order into an oppressive maze where hope was easy to lose. Even before its infamy as the birthplace of the lobotomy, Danvers' very existence carried a haunting symbolism. It was built on the optimism of an era that believed mental illness could be cured through control, yet it quickly revealed the darker truth, that when institutions are built to contain suffering, they often end up magnifying it. For the people of Massachusetts, the opening of Danvers was a spectacle of progress. For the patients who entered, it became a descent into a world from which few ever truly escaped. The hill on which it stood watched silently, bearing witness as the line between healing and horror dissolved. The introduction of this story is not merely about bricks, spires, and stone. It is about the thin veil that separates good intentions from tragedy, reform from cruelty, science from madness. Danvers State Hospital stands as a chilling reminder that history is often written not by the ideals of its architects, but by the lived experiences of those trapped within. And from its very first year, whispers of unease began to grow into a chorus of fear, an omen of the nightmares that would unfold inside this fortress of the mind. After the dust of the American Civil War settled in the 1860s, Massachusetts was a state in transition. The Industrial Revolution had transformed once rural towns into sprawling hubs of factories and railroads, drawing in immigrants and fueling rapid urban growth. The human cost of that progress, however, was immense. Veterans returned home scarred in both body and mind, while impoverished families crowded into cities where disease, alcoholism, and mental instability ran unchecked. For reformers, this was an age of optimism, a chance to apply science, reason, and moral order to society's most pressing problems. For the mentally ill, it was an age of uncertainty, where compassion and cruelty were often separated by the thinnest of lines. It is here, in this turbulent context, that the seeds of Danvers State Hospital were planted. 19th century America was in the grip of a reformist spirit. From abolitionists to temperance advocates, from women's rights activists to prison reformers, every corner of life was being questioned and reshaped. Among the loudest voices were those who championed the cause of the mentally ill. Prior to this movement, those suffering from psychiatric conditions were often confined to almshouses, jails, or left to wander the streets. They were viewed as burdens rather than patients, objects of fear rather than individuals in need of care. But by the mid-1800s, a new philosophy had gained traction, the doctrine of moral treatment. This approach, influenced by European models, emphasized kindness, structure, and peaceful surroundings as a way to rehabilitate troubled minds. The asylum, it was believed, could serve as both sanctuary and cure. Massachusetts embraced this philosophy with fervor. Reformers such as Dorothea Dix, a tireless advocate for humane treatment of the mentally ill, argued that specialized hospitals would offer a chance at recovery where neglect had only deepened suffering. Her campaigns led to the construction of several state institutions, each designed to embody the lofty ideals of moral treatment. Danvers would eventually become the crown jewel of these efforts, though no one could predict the horrors that would unfold within its walls. At the time, the project represented hope, an investment in science, architecture, and compassion that reformers believed would transform lives. The late 1860s were also an age of contrasts. On the one hand, science was advancing rapidly. Theories of the human brain, however flawed, promised new insights into mental illness. Physicians spoke of nervous disorders, melancholia, and hysteria in increasingly clinical terms. On the other hand, superstition and fear still lingered. In small towns across Massachusetts, whispers of witchcraft, curses, and madness clung stubbornly to folklore. The infamous Salem witch trials, though nearly 2 centuries past, remained etched into the cultural memory, their legacy of fear and scapegoating never entirely forgotten. The decision to place Danvers State Hospital on a hill overlooking the old Salem village carried with it echoes of this grim history. Whether intentionally or not, the asylum would rise on ground haunted by both myth and memory. The construction of Danvers reflected broader architectural trends of the period. The Kirkbride Plan, a revolutionary blueprint for mental hospitals, became the gold standard. Conceived by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, this design emphasized long, staggered wings that radiated from a central hub, allowing maximum sunlight, ventilation, and separation of patients by condition. It was meant to balance structure with serenity, to create an environment that soothed rather than confined. Massachusetts officials saw in this plan the perfect solution to their growing crisis, a hospital that was both functional and symbolic, a grand monument to progress and order. But ideals on paper rarely survive the realities of overcrowding, underfunding, and human frailty. In truth, the push for asylums was driven as much by social pressure as by compassion. Families overwhelmed by relatives they could not care for demanded relief. Cities choked with poverty sought to remove undesirables from public view. Politicians, eager to display Massachusetts as a beacon of reform, embraced large-scale projects that projected authority and modernity. Danvers, therefore, was not only a medical institution but a political statement, a declaration that society could control what it feared most: chaos, madness, and the breakdown of order. Yet beneath this optimism lurked contradictions. For every reformer advocating gentle care, there were bureaucrats calculating costs and legislators eager to hide social problems from sight. For every promise of healing, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that asylums also functioned as warehouses, places to deposit those who could not be managed elsewhere. Even before the first patient was admitted, Danvers carried the weight of impossible expectations. It was to be a place of healing, yet also a place of exile. It was to offer dignity, yet also strip away identity. These tensions would shape its destiny, and ultimately ensure that the hospital's story would be remembered not as triumph, but as tragedy. The 1860s also marked a shift in how society viewed mental illness itself. Increasingly, doctors framed psychiatric disorders as medical conditions rather than moral failings. This shift suggested progress, but it also invited experimentation. With no clear cures, physicians turned asylums into laboratories, testing theories on the very people society had cast aside. Patients were subjected to treatments that ranged from the benign, rest, diet, and fresh air, to the extreme, restraints, isolation, and invasive procedures. Reformers imagined science as salvation, but in practice, it often became another form of control. Danvers was conceived in this environment, where hope and hubris coexisted, and where the boundary between therapy and torment was frighteningly thin. The Massachusetts of 1869 was therefore a place of paradox. It was progressive yet haunted, compassionate yet cruel, rational yet superstitious. The decision to build Danvers State Hospital reflected these contradictions. To some, it was a shining example of how far society had come in its treatment of the mentally ill. To others, it was a grim reminder that institutions, however well-intentioned, often become monuments to suffering. As the cornerstone was laid and the walls began to rise, few could have imagined the shadows that would one day stretch from its windows. The asylum promised light, but in time it would become one of the darkest places in American history. And so, as 1869 dawned, Massachusetts stood proudly at the forefront of mental health reform. Newspapers spoke of progress, reformers praised the future, and politicians celebrated a victory for public welfare. Yet already, cracks were forming in the foundation, not just in the stones of the building, but in the philosophy that underpinned it. Danvers was not merely a hospital, it was a reflection of its age, an age that sought to impose order on madness, but too often created deeper madness in the process. The Hilltop Asylum would come to embody the very contradictions of the society that built it, and its legacy would echo far beyond Massachusetts, into the very heart of America's troubled history with mental illness. When the decision was finalized to create a new asylum on the hills of Danvers, the state turned to an architect whose vision would come to define the institution's haunting identity. Nathaniel J. Bradley, a prominent Boston architect, was entrusted with the task of shaping a facility that would embody the very spirit of reform. His design followed the guidelines of the Kirkbride Plan, a radical blueprint for mental hospitals that sought to merge architecture with therapy. The structure would not be a simple building, but a carefully engineered environment meant to heal. Yet in the sprawling wings, the towering central steeples, and the labyrinth of corridors he designed, something else was born, something that felt less like sanctuary and more like a fortress of shadows. The Kirkbride philosophy, pioneered by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, was revolutionary for its time. He believed that the environment itself could play a vital role in curing mental illness. Patients should be surrounded by beauty and order, exposed to sunlight and fresh air, and housed in a building that inspired calm rather than terror. The plan called for a central administration building flanked by long, staggered wings, each tiered outward so that light and air reached every room. The sickest patients were to be placed at the farthest ends, while those deemed more stable lived closer to the center. This progression was meant to symbolize recovery, guiding patients from the shadows of madness toward the light of reintegration. On paper, it was a design of hope. In practice, at Danvers, it became a design of despair. The site chosen was as symbolic as the architecture itself. The hill in Danvers, once part of Salem Village, was steeped in the legacy of the infamous witch trials of 1692. In fact, the land had been associated with Judge John Hathorne, one of the most ruthless magistrates of that bloody episode. To build a hospital for the insane on such cursed soil felt both ironic and foreboding. Reformers, blinded by optimism, saw only a hilltop vantage point that offered fresh breezes and separation from the noise of the towns below. The choice was practical. Isolation was seen as therapeutic, shielding patients from the corrupting influences of society. But for those who later gazed upon the asylum's looming silhouette, the connection to Salem's dark past was impossible to ignore. When construction began, the scale of the project stunned the public. Rising in the Gothic Revival style, the hospital resembled a medieval castle more than a place of healing. Its red brick exterior stretched nearly 1,400 feet across the hilltop, with a massive central tower piercing the sky. Inside, the design balanced grandeur with utility: long corridors, arched windows, high ceilings, and separate wards for men and women. There were spaces for dining, work, recreation, and even chapels, all intended to provide structure to patients' lives. Reformers boasted that the building would stand as a monument to progress, its very walls testifying to the state's commitment to the care of the mentally ill. Yet almost immediately, the sheer scale raised questions. To some, the asylum's imposing presence looked more like a fortress designed to contain the unwanted than a sanctuary designed to heal them. By 1878, as the finishing touches were applied, Danvers State Hospital was ready to admit its first patients. It was designed to accommodate 450 to 500 individuals, a number considered manageable for the therapeutic ideals of the Kirkbride system. Doctors and administrators envisioned a carefully controlled environment where order would replace chaos. Patients would be kept in separate wards according to their conditions, violent, melancholic, epileptic, or otherwise, and staff would oversee their progress in a structured routine. It was a system that promised discipline and dignity. But even in its early days, cracks began to appear. The very isolation that was meant to be therapeutic quickly became alienating. Patients were cut off from their families, their communities, and the outside world. For some, this separation deepened their despair. For others, it ensured they would never leave. The size of the hospital, so celebrated by reformers, became overwhelming. Endless corridors stretched like mazes, disorienting both staff and patients. The Gothic architecture, meant to inspire or, often instilled fear. For the men and women confined there, the asylum's grandeur translated into oppression, its towering walls a constant reminder of their captivity. The hospital administration struggled from the start. The optimism of reformers clashed with the realities of underfunding and political pressure. Staff were overworked, resources were stretched thin, and the number of patients admitted quickly exceeded the intended capacity. Within a few short years, Danvers had begun to outgrow itself. Beds filled, then hallways, then basements. The Kirkbride plan's delicate balance, light, air, order, was disrupted by the sheer volume of humans suffering crammed within the walls. Instead of a model institution, Danvers was rapidly becoming a warehouse for the unwanted. For the public, the hospital remained a source of fascination. Local newspapers reported on its construction and opening with a mixture of pride and awe. Visitors admired the architecture and praised Massachusetts for its commitment to progressive care. But behind the closed doors of the wards, the reality was far less optimistic. Patients arrived in states of confusion, terror, and hopelessness, often committed for conditions as varied as depression, epilepsy, alcoholism, or simple eccentricity. Some were admitted voluntarily, others against their will, but all entered a system that promised treatment and instead delivered confinement. Danvers State Hospital, in its earliest years, embodied the paradox of psychiatric reform in the 19th century. It was both a symbol of progress and a prison of despair, a structure born of optimism yet haunted by its very design. The sprawling wings and towering spires stood as monuments to the era's belief in science and order, but within their walls, the first seeds of suffering were already being sown. The hospital's birth was not merely the creation of a building, but the creation of a stage upon which one of America's darkest medical dramas would play out. And though it began with high ideals, Danvers was already destined to become something else entirely. A place where the boundaries between healing and horror would dissolve into nightmare. From the moment the first patients crossed the threshold of Danvers State Hospital, life inside its towering Gothic walls followed a rhythm unlike anything beyond the hill. It was a world governed by routine, discipline, and an ever-present sense of surveillance. To the administrators, structure was therapy, every hour accounted for, every movement observed. To the patients, however, the days blurred into a cycle of monotony punctuated by moments of fear, humiliation, and pain. The asylum was designed to be a sanctuary of healing, but for those who lived inside, it quickly became a labyrinth of control. The daily life of patients began before dawn. At the ringing of bells or the call of attendants, they were roused from their narrow beds in dormitory-style wards or, for the more violent and unstable, from isolation rooms with heavy iron doors. Uniformity was enforced from the start. Patients were often stripped of personal belongings, their hair cropped short, and their clothing replaced with institutional garments. Individual identity, considered an obstacle to treatment, was erased in favor of conformity. Even names were sometimes reduced to numbers in hospital records. For many, admission to Danvers meant the loss of self as much as the loss of freedom. Meals were communal, served in cavernous dining halls beneath arched ceilings. The food was simple, often bland, and strictly rationed. Patients ate in silence, watched carefully by attendants who intervened at the slightest disturbance. After breakfast, the day unfolded according to a rigid schedule. Those deemed capable of labor were assigned tasks. Men worked on the hospital's farms, tending crops, and livestock, while women labored in laundries, kitchens, or sewing rooms. This work was considered therapeutic, instilling discipline and providing purpose. In reality, it also functioned as free labor, sustaining the institution's massive operations while exploiting the very people it claimed to serve. For others, particularly those too ill or resistant to labor, the day was spent in confinement. Some patients were encouraged to read, walk in the courtyards, or engage in recreational activities like music or crafts. But as the population swelled far beyond intended capacity, such luxuries became rare. Patients found themselves crammed into wards with little to occupy their minds, their days dissolving into endless stretches of idleness and despair. Overcrowding meant fewer staff per patient, less individualized care, and more reliance on restraints, both physical and chemical. Life at Danvers became less about treatment and more about containment. The physical environment contributed to this oppressive atmosphere. The corridors were long, echoing chambers that magnified the smaller sound, a slammed door, a scream, the shuffle of footsteps. Windows, though large, were barred, and the constant clang of locks and keys reminded patients that freedom was far away. The hospital's size, once praised as a model of order, became overwhelming. Many patients described feelings of disorientation, as though they were lost in a maze. Even staff reported that the endless wings and staircases created an atmosphere of confusion. The building itself seemed to press down on those inside, transforming architecture intended for healing into a structure of surveillance and control. Restraints were a daily reality for many. Leather straps, straitjackets, and metal cuffs were used to subdue patients deemed dangerous or unmanageable. Seclusion rooms, padded or bare, confined individuals in silence for hours, sometimes days. Hydrotherapy, another favored method, saw patients submerged in ice-cold baths or wrapped tightly in wet sheets, their movements restricted. These treatments were justified as calming measures, but for those subjected to them, they were indistinguishable from punishment. Stories from attendants later revealed that such measures were often used not as therapy but as convenience, a way to control patients when staff numbers were too few or tempers too short. Yet, despite the suffering, life at Danvers was not entirely devoid of human warmth. Some attendants genuinely believed in their mission, offering small kindnesses to patients who otherwise received none. There were moments of fleeting joy, music played in recreation rooms, religious services that brought a sense of community, occasional outings into the hospital gardens. But these moments were overshadowed by the sheer scale of misery. For every patient who found temporary comfort, dozens more languished in neglect. The balance between care and cruelty tipped steadily toward the latter as the decades wore on. By the late 19th century, the hospital was already facing the pressures of overcrowding. Built for 500 patients, it soon held over 1,000, and within decades, more than 2,000. With every bed filled, makeshift cots were crammed into hallways, basements, and even attics. Privacy vanished, and with it any sense of dignity. Attendants struggled to manage the swelling population, often resorting to harsher measures of control. Sanitation deteriorated, food supply strained, and outbreaks of disease became common. Visitors to the hospital reported a stench of unwashed bodies and human waste, a far cry from the gleaming institution once celebrated as a beacon of progress. For many patients, life at Danvers became an endless cycle of degradation. Letters home were censored or never sent, families stopped visiting, and outside contact withered. Patients who entered with hopes of recovery often found themselves trapped indefinitely. Diagnoses were vague and elastic: melancholia, hysteria, mania, epilepsy, and the line between mental illness and social deviance was thin. Women who defied domestic expectations, immigrants who struggled to assimilate, or individuals whose behavior simply unsettled society could all find themselves locked away. For them, daily life inside Danvers was not a journey toward healing but a sentence without appeal. To the outside world, the hospital still projected an image of order. Annual reports spoke of therapeutic routines, medical progress, and the dedication of staff. Newspapers highlighted the institution's farms and workshops as examples of productive rehabilitation. But behind the official narrative lay a harsher truth. Daily life inside Danvers was defined less by compassion than by control. Patients became numbers, wards became warehouses, and the promise of moral treatment gave way to the grim reality of survival. For those who lived it, the experience of Danvers was unforgettable. Former patients spoke of the crushing monotony, the constant surveillance, and the gnawing sense of being forgotten. For some, the hospital was a place where minds unraveled completely, broken not by illness but by the institution itself. For others, it was simply a place where time ceased to matter, where each day bled into the next until identity itself dissolved. This was life inside the walls of Danvers, a world of endless corridors, silent suffering, and fleeting moments of humanity lost within an ocean of despair. The most chilling legacy of Danvers State Hospital is not only the sheer volume of suffering contained within its walls, but the treatments that were inflicted upon its patients in the name of medicine. What reformers once envisioned as a place of moral care quickly transformed into a laboratory of experimentation, where the boundary between therapy and torture blurred until it was nearly impossible to tell the difference. From restraints and ice baths to the infamous lobotomy, Danvers became a proving ground for practices that left thousands broken in body and mind. What the state called progress was, for countless patients, nothing less than a descent into sanctioned cruelty. In the earliest years, treatments were rooted in the ideals of moral therapy, but even then, the reality was often harsh. Patients were subjected to physical restraints, straitjackets, leather cuffs, locked chairs, under the guise of preventing self-harm or violence. Hydrotherapy, a favored method, placed individuals in ice-cold baths for hours at a time or bound them in wet sheets until they could not move. Doctors claimed such methods calmed agitated minds, but to patients, they felt indistinguishable from punishment. Stories surfaced of men and women shivering uncontrollably, left until their lips turned blue, their bodies numbed into silence. For the staff, these practices offered control. For the patients, they offered only terror. As medical theories evolved, Danvers embraced new methods with disturbing enthusiasm. Electroconvulsive therapy, then called electroshock, was introduced as a way to reset the brain. Patients were strapped to tables, electrodes pressed against their temples, and jolts of electricity surged through their skulls. Their bodies convulsed violently, teeth shattering, bones sometimes breaking under the force. Doctors insisted the therapy was effective, claiming improvements in mood or behavior, but the results were inconsistent at best. Many patients emerged disoriented, with memory loss so profound they forgot their own names. The screams from the shock rooms became part of the daily soundscape of the asylum, a reminder to all inside that healing often came cloaked in agony. Another widely adopted practice was insulin shock therapy, a brutal regimen that pushed patients into daily comas. Doses of insulin were injected to deliberately lower blood sugar to dangerous levels, causing seizures and unconsciousness. The theory was that the brain, shocked by these induced comas, would reboot, offering relief from schizophrenia or depression. In reality, the therapy left many patients permanently damaged. Some never woke at all. Nurses recall the eerie sight of entire wards filled with comatose patients, their bodies twitching or drenched in sweat, while doctors meticulously recorded outcomes in clinical notes that rarely acknowledged the suffering before them. Even more invasive methods soon followed. Surgeries such as tooth extractions, tonsillectomies, and even hysterectomies were performed on the belief that mental illness was rooted in physical defects. Women in particular were targeted, with doctors claiming that removing reproductive organs could cure hysteria or melancholy. These procedures were carried out with little consent, often under the assumption that institutionalized patients had forfeited their rights. The operating theaters of Danvers became places where experimental medicine overstepped the line into mutilation. Patients emerged scarred, both physically and emotionally. Their conditions rarely improved and often worsened. By the mid-20th century, Danvers had become synonymous with one of the darkest treatments in psychiatric history, the prefrontal lobotomy. Though this procedure would eventually be explored in more detail later, it began here in earnest. Surgeons drilled into skulls, severing the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain. It was hailed as a miracle cure for aggression, depression, and schizophrenia. In practice, it often reduced patients to docile shells, robbed of personality, memory, and autonomy. Some patients emerged calm and compliant, but vacant. Others never survived the operation. Danvers was among the first hospitals in the United States to adopt lobotomies on a large scale, cementing its reputation as the birthplace of this horrific chapter in medical history. But perhaps most insidious of all was the atmosphere of experimentation that permeated Danvers. Physicians, under pressure to demonstrate progress, viewed their patients as test subjects. Treatments were introduced and abandoned in rapid succession. Ice baths one decade, insulin shocks the next, lobotomies soon after. Each was heralded as a breakthrough, each justified as science, and each inflicted immense suffering on the powerless individuals trapped inside. Patients rarely understood what was being done to them. Consent was non-existent. Inmates of the asylum were treated as bodies to be managed, not people to be healed. The language of medical reports concealed the human cost. Administrators wrote of improvements, reductions in agitation, and behavioral compliance. But behind those sterile words were lives shattered by trauma. A man subjected to repeated shocks might spend his final years unable to recall his children's faces. A woman who underwent a hysterectomy might spiral into deeper despair, her body permanently altered for a cure that never came. A teenager given insulin therapy might never awaken from his induced coma. The hospital's records rarely recorded these tragedies in detail, but the silence in its corridors told the truth. For many, treatment meant the extinguishing of self. The staff themselves were caught in contradictions. Some doctors sincerely believed they were advancing science, convinced that harsh methods were necessary for progress. Others were more cynical, using the asylum as a stage for ambition, eager to publish results and earn prestige. Nurses, often overworked and undertrained, carried out orders with little room for dissent, their compassion eroded by exhaustion and the overwhelming numbers of patients. In such an environment, cruelty could be rationalized, normalized, and eventually forgotten. For patients, the treatments defined their existence. Each day carried the possibility of being strapped to a table, dunked into a bath, or led into a surgical room. The anticipation of pain was itself a form of torture. Many became silent, withdrawn, their spirits broken not by mental illness but by the relentless assaults of so-called therapy. To outsiders, Danvers remained a place of science and progress. To those inside, it was a theatre of suffering, where every cure came at the cost of dignity, autonomy, and often life itself. The tragedy of Danvers lies in this paradox. The treatments inflicted there were not the result of malice alone, but of a society desperate to control what it could not understand. Doctors sought cures, politicians demanded results, and families prayed for miracles. In their pursuit of solutions, they sanctioned practices that destroyed the very people they sought to save. The history of Danvers State Hospital is therefore not just the story of a single institution, but a chilling reminder of what happens when human suffering becomes an opportunity for experimentation. The line between treatment and torture vanishes, and what remains are scars that echo long after the screams have faded. The reputation of Danvers State Hospital as a place of nightmares did not emerge from architecture alone, nor solely from the harsh treatments carried out within its walls. It was built on the lives, and often the deaths, of thousands of men, women, and children who passed through its wards and never came out again. Their names, in most cases, were erased from history. Their identities dissolved into numbers and logbooks, their bodies laid in unmarked graves on the hospital grounds. Each patient carried a story. Some were tragic, some cruel, some simply forgotten. Together, these stories formed the shadows of suffering that lingered in Danvers long after the doors closed. Among the most haunting aspects of the hospital's history is the sheer number of lives lost there. Designed to house around 500 patients, Danvers swelled to accommodate more than 2,000 at its peak. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and lack of medical oversight created conditions ripe for disease and neglect. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza swept through the wards with devastating regularity. Patients, already weakened by malnutrition and inadequate care, often stood little chance of survival. Death was so common that the hospital established its own burial grounds, simple fields where bodies were interred beneath markers bearing only numbers, no names. To this day, hundreds of anonymous graves remain scattered across the property, silent witnesses to forgotten lives. Records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveal a litany of disturbing cases. Patients committed for minor conditions, such as postpartum depression, epilepsy, alcoholism, or even domestic disobedience, often languished for decades. Many died within the hospital, their illnesses compounded by mistreatment. One documented case involved a young woman admitted for what doctors termed nervous exhaustion. Within months, she was subjected to repeated restraints, ice baths, and eventually electroshock. Her health deteriorated rapidly, and she died at the age of 24. Official reports listed heart failure as the cause of death, but nurses who later spoke out suggested she had simply been broken by the treatments themselves. Neglect was another recurring theme. As the hospital grew overcrowded, staff were stretched beyond capacity. Attendants sometimes managed wards of 50 or 60 patients alone. Hygiene deteriorated to appalling levels. Reports described patients lying in soiled bedding for days, their cries ignored. Malnutrition became common, with meager rations that barely sustained life. In such conditions, patients who required specialized care, those with chronic illnesses, physical disabilities, or severe psychiatric conditions, often wasted away in silence. Scandals occasionally reached the outside world, pulling back the curtain on the horrors within. In the early 1900s, a series of newspaper exposés described patients restrained for weeks at a time, left in filth, or beaten by attendants. Families who visited spoke of their loved ones appearing gaunt, bruised, or unrecognizable. One particularly infamous incident involved a patient discovered dead in a restraint chair, his body slumped after being left unattended for hours. The hospital labeled it an accident. For the public, it was a glimpse of the truth, that Danvers, far from being a place of healing, was a place where suffering was hidden until it could no longer be ignored. Some of the most heartbreaking accounts come from children. Though primarily built for adults, Danvers also admitted adolescents and, in some cases, younger children deemed unmanageable. Many of these were orphans or wards of the state, with no family to advocate for them. Inside the asylum, they endured the same treatments as adults: restraints, isolation, even experimental therapies. Their voices were the quietest, their fates the easiest to erase. Records indicate that children as young as 10 were buried in the hospital cemeteries, their short lives consumed by an institution that was supposed to protect them. The staff were not immune to the corruption of the system. Over the decades, cases of abuse and misconduct surfaced. Some attendants, overwhelmed and embittered, lashed out at patients with physical violence. Others engaged in theft, stealing from the meager belongings of those in their care. There were even allegations of sexual abuse, though these were rarely pursued in court. The imbalance of power within the asylum made such violations possible, with patients too discredited or silenced to defend themselves. In many cases, their accusations were dismissed as symptoms of delusion or madness, ensuring that justice was almost never served. Beyond the individual tragedies, the collective atmosphere of Danvers was one of despair. Patients spoke, when they could, of endless days filled with fear and loneliness. Some wrote letters pleading for release, letters that were often censored or never sent. Diaries recovered from former attendants described the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that pervaded the wards, a heaviness that seemed to seep into the very walls. The hospital became not only a place of suffering but a machine that perpetuated it, trapping generations in cycles of neglect and abuse. The burial grounds remain perhaps the starkest reminder of these forgotten lives. Rows upon rows of anonymous graves, marked only with small-numbered stones, stretch across the property. No flowers, no epitaphs, no names. Families who later searched for their loved ones often found nothing but silence. The hospital kept records, but many were incomplete, lost, or deliberately vague. For thousands of men and women, their final resting place became a patch of earth in Danvers, their identities dissolved into statistics. The anonymity was a second death, one of memory and recognition. For the surrounding community, these tragedies were both hidden and visible. Whispers circulated about screams echoing across the hill at night, about patients wandering into town when escapes occurred, about funerals that seemed too frequent. Yet the institution remained a powerful presence, too large and too politically entrenched to be easily challenged. Families who complained risked retaliation or were told that their loved ones were better off confined. The suffering of patients became an open secret, acknowledged in whispers, denied in public. The shadows of Danvers were not only physical but spiritual. For many, the suffering left behind an aura of haunting. Staff reported feeling watched in empty corridors, hearing footsteps where no one walked, or encountering cold drafts in locked rooms. Whether supernatural or psychological, the atmosphere was undeniably heavy, infused with the weight of untold stories. Long before the hospital became a ruin sought out by ghost hunters, its reputation as a place of restless souls had already taken root. The stories of Danvers State Hospital are not just about medical failure but about human neglect on a vast scale. Each anonymous grave, each silenced voice, represents a life that might have been different had compassion outweighed control, had dignity been valued above convenience. Instead, the hospital became a graveyard of forgotten histories, its walls echoing with the suffering of thousands. To speak of Danvers is to remember them, to bring into the light the shadows of suffering that the institution sought to bury. By the mid-20th century, the reputation of Danvers State Hospital had shifted dramatically. What had once been heralded as a model of reform was now infamous as one of the most overcrowded, underfunded, and abusive institutions in the United States. The transformation was not sudden, but gradual, a steady erosion of ideals under the crushing weight of reality. By the 1940s and 1950s, the cracks could no longer be concealed. Danvers had become a symbol, not of progress, but of the failure of America's asylum system. Overcrowding was the single greatest catalyst for this decline. Designed to hold 500 patients, the hospital was already straining at 1,000 by the early 1900s. By mid-century, that number ballooned to more than 2,000, sometimes even 2,500. Hallways, basements, and attics were converted into makeshift dormitories. Patients slept side by side in rows of cots, with no privacy, little sanitation, and constant noise. Attendants, hopelessly outnumbered, struggled to maintain order. In such conditions, even the most well-meaning staff resorted to restraints and sedation as tools of survival. The environment of moral treatment envisioned by the reformers had collapsed into chaos. The physical decay of the hospital mirrored its moral collapse. Paint peeled from the once grand Gothic walls. Windows cracked and were left unrepaired. Plumbing failed, leaving some wards without reliable running water. The smell of human waste became inescapable. Rats and insects infested the kitchens and storerooms. Visitors who toured the facility reported conditions more reminiscent of a prison than a hospital. The contrast between the towering facade of the building and the squalor within its wards became a metaphor for the institution itself, outwardly impressive, inwardly rotting. By the 1940s, journalists began to pull back the curtain. Exposés in local and national newspapers painted a grim picture of life at Danvers. Reports described patients tied to benches, left in their own filth, or wandering aimlessly in overcrowded wards. Whistleblowers, often nurses or attendants who could no longer remain silent, provided harrowing testimony. One article described human warehouses where the living conditions were so inhumane that patients resembled animals more than people. These reports shocked the public, but they also confirmed what many families already suspected, that once a loved one entered Danvers, they were effectively abandoned to suffering. Lawsuits soon followed. Families sued the hospital for neglect and wrongful death, though few cases ever reached trial. The state, wary of scandal, often settled quietly or dismissed claims on technicalities. Yet the lawsuits, however muted, drew more attention to the institution's failings. Advocates for mental health reform used Danvers as an example of why the asylum model had to be re-examined. By the 1960s, Danvers was no longer the pride of Massachusetts, it was its shame. Patients' voices also began to emerge, though often filtered through intermediaries. Letters smuggled out of the hospital described conditions of terror. Some wrote of beatings by attendants, of being locked in seclusion for weeks, of being forced into experimental treatments without explanation. Former patients who were released sometimes spoke publicly of their experiences, though their credibility was often questioned due to their diagnoses. Yet as these accounts accumulated, they painted a consistent picture. Danvers was not a hospital of healing, but a warehouse of human misery. The rise of popular media further cemented Danvers' dark reputation. Newspapers frequently referred to it as the asylum on the hill, a phrase that conjured images of Gothic horror. Journalists highlighted its connections to the Salem witch trials, emphasizing the sinister aura of the land itself. By the 1970s, the hospital was featured in documentaries, books, and eventually horror fiction, often depicted as the archetypal haunted asylum. Its sheer size, its history of lobotomies, and the countless anonymous graves on its property made it irresistible fodder for the macabre imagination. Political pressure mounted as well. Massachusetts faced growing criticism for its mental health system, with Danvers at the center of the storm. Legislators debated funding cuts, closures, and reforms, but progress was slow. Deinstitutionalization, spurred by new psychiatric medications and changing public attitudes, offered one path forward, but it also left many patients homeless, untreated, and vulnerable. Danvers, once overcrowded, began to empty, yet its reputation only grew darker. The image of its crumbling wards and abandoned patients became a potent symbol of institutional failure. Staff morale deteriorated alongside the hospital's reputation. Many attendants worked long shifts with little training, their compassion eroded by exhaustion. Violence became common, between patients and between staff and patients. Some attendants developed reputations for cruelty, using fists, batons, or restraints to enforce order. Others simply gave up, turning a blind eye to abuse and neglect. A few courageous whistleblowers spoke out, but most remained silent, fearful of losing their jobs. For those who worked there, Danvers became less a place of healing than a place of survival. The community around Danvers also shifted in its perception. What had once been a source of civic pride became an object of fear and shame. Residents whispered about screams heard from the hill at night, about bodies carried quietly to the cemetery, about the unmarked graves. Teenagers dared each other to approach the looming structure, treating it as a haunted house rather than a functioning hospital. By the late 20th century, the asylum had become part of local folklore, a place both feared and sensationalized. Perhaps the most damning indictment of all was the silence that surrounded so much of the suffering. For decades, families accepted the official narrative of treatment and progress, even as their loved ones wasted away inside. The state buried the dead in numbered graves, rarely notifying relatives. Administrators filed sanitized reports that disguised abuse behind clinical language. Society at large preferred not to look too closely, comforted by the illusion that the problem of mental illness had been contained on a hill in Danvers. The descent of Danvers into infamy was, in many ways, inevitable. Its vast size, its overcrowding, its experimental treatments, all converged into a perfect storm of neglect and abuse. What began as a beacon of reform became a monument to failure, a place where ideals were crushed beneath the weight of reality. By the time the 20th century drew to a close, Danvers was no longer merely a hospital. It was a symbol of the cruelty and complacency that had defined America's treatment of its most vulnerable. Its towering spires loomed not as a promise of hope, but as a warning of what happens when compassion yields to control. By the mid-20th century, Danvers State Hospital was no longer just an asylum. It was a laboratory for one of the most controversial and devastating procedures in medical history, the lobotomy. If the overcrowding and neglect had already turned the hospital into a place of despair, the arrival of this so-called miracle cure pushed it into the realm of true infamy. Here, in the very halls of Danvers, some of the earliest large-scale lobotomies were performed, forever altering the lives of patients in ways both horrifying and irreversible. To the medical establishment of the time, Danvers was hailed as a pioneer. To those who endured the procedure, it was a sight of unspeakable violation. The lobotomy was the brainchild of Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz, who in 1935 first introduced the idea of severing connections in the brain's frontal lobes to treat mental illness. He believed that mental disorders were the result of fixed patterns of thought, and by disrupting those neural pathways, patients could be freed from their symptoms. For this work, Moniz would later receive the Nobel Prize in Medicine, a fact that underscores the chilling acceptance of the practice by the global medical community. From Europe, the procedure quickly spread to the United States, where psychiatrists desperate for solutions to overcrowded asylums seized upon it with fervor. Danvers became one of the first American institutions to embrace the lobotomy. The timing could not have been more consequential. The hospital, already bursting with thousands of patients, was drowning in chaos. Staff were overwhelmed, treatments like electroshock and insulin therapy were producing inconsistent results, and the state demanded answers. Into this environment came Dr. Walter Freeman and his collaborator Dr. James Watts, the American champions of lobotomy. Freeman, in particular, was a charismatic figure who saw himself as a revolutionary, unafraid to push boundaries. When he arrived at Danvers, he found both eager doctors and a surplus of patients deemed suitable for experimentation. The procedure itself was deceptively simple and horrifying in its execution. In its early form, surgeons drilled holes into the skull, inserting instruments to cut the white matter of the frontal lobes. Later, Freeman introduced his infamous ice pick technique, known as the transorbital lobotomy. With this method, he slid a thin metal pick through the eye socket, just above the tear duct, and with a few taps of a mallet, punctured the thin bone behind the eye. A sweeping motion severed the connections in the brain. The entire procedure could be completed in under 10 minutes, often without anesthesia, using only electroshock to render the patient unconscious. Freeman performed demonstrations with theatrical flair, sometimes completing dozens in a single day. At Danvers, hundreds of patients were subjected to this procedure. Many were selected not because they were truly violent or dangerous, but because they were difficult to manage, noisy, or simply non-compliant. The lobotomy was marketed as a cure-all for schizophrenia, depression, mania, and even alcoholism. In truth, it was little more than a crude form of brain damage. Patients who once resisted orders became docile, compliant, and easier to control. To administrators, this was considered success. To families, it was often a devastating transformation. The results varied wildly, but few could be called cures. Some patients emerged quieter, their agitation reduced, but along with it, their personalities, memories, and independence. Others became vacant, their eyes dull, their speech slurred, their capacity for self-care destroyed. A significant number did not survive at all, succumbing to hemorrhage, infection, or seizures. One nurse at Danvers recalled wards filled with patients who sat like statues, staring into nothing, drooling, unable to speak. These were the so-called successes, bodies that were easier to manage, minds erased. Yet despite the horror, lobotomies at Danvers were celebrated in their time. Doctors published glowing reports of improved behavior and reduced overcrowding. Freeman himself often photographed patients before and after surgery, proudly showcasing the transformation. The press, hungry for stories of medical miracles, reported on lobotomies with enthusiasm, calling them breakthroughs. In the 1940s and early 1950s, public perception largely aligned with medical optimism. Only later would the truth begin to surface. For the patients themselves, the lobotomy was a sentence disguised as salvation. Many were committed without consent, their families persuaded by doctors that this was their best, or only, hope. Some relatives later expressed regret, recalling how their loved ones returned unrecognizable, stripped of ambition, joy, or will. Children of lobotomized parents grew up with hollow shells where vibrant personalities had once been. In Danvers, these tragedies multiplied. One life after another reduced to silence in the name of progress. The atmosphere inside the hospital during the lobotomy era was one of grim efficiency. Operating rooms became assembly lines. Patients were prepped, shocked unconscious, and lined up for the procedure. Freeman's showmanship, often described as cavalier, added an element of grotesque performance. He was known to conduct surgeries without gloves, to pose with his instruments, and to speak of his patients in detached, clinical terms. To him, Danvers was a stage where he could demonstrate his daring methods. To the patients, it was a slaughterhouse of minds. By the late 1950s, the tide began to turn. New psychiatric drugs, particularly chlorpromazine, thorazine, offered less invasive alternatives to control symptoms. At the same time, reports of lobotomy's devastating consequences began to accumulate. Families spoke out, journalists investigated, and the medical community itself grew uneasy. In 1954, the Saturday Evening Post published a damning exposé, and Freeman's reputation began to crumble. Yet by then, thousands of lobotomies had already been performed across the United States, and Danvers bore more than its share of the toll. The legacy of lobotomy at Danvers is difficult to quantify in numbers, but its impact is unmistakable. The hospital became forever linked with the procedure, remembered as one of its earliest and most enthusiastic adopters. For decades, whispers spread through the community, stories of neighbors, relatives, and friends who had gone into Danvers vibrant and difficult, only to emerge vacant or not at all. The cemetery on the hospital grounds filled with more anonymous graves, many of them belonging to lobotomized patients who never recovered. Today, the lobotomy stands as one of the darkest chapters in medical history, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked experimentation and desperation masquerading as science. And in that history, Danvers holds a central place. The hospital's embrace of the procedure cemented its reputation as not only a place of neglect but of active harm, where the pursuit of control was valued above the sanctity of the human mind. The spires of Danvers, already looming with menace, came to symbolize not healing, but the surgical silencing of thousands of voices. The story of lobotomy at Danvers is not just a medical tale, it is a human one. It is the story of individuals robbed of their essence, families torn apart by misplaced trust, and a society so desperate to manage madness that it sanctioned the destruction of minds. Within those Gothic walls, the line between doctor and executioner blurred, and the legacy of that blur continues to haunt psychiatric history. By the 1960s, the tide of psychiatric care in America was shifting. The asylum era that had dominated for more than a century was collapsing under its own weight. Across the nation, massive institutions once hailed as marvels of reform had decayed into overcrowded warehouses, and Danvers State Hospital was no exception. The very building that had symbolized hope in 1869 now stood as a crumbling relic of failure. Its Gothic spires, once intended to inspire awe, became grim monuments to a system that could no longer sustain itself. The process of deinstitutionalization, spurred by new medications, political reform, and public outrage, spelled the beginning of the end for Danvers. Yet its decline was not swift, nor merciful. Instead, the hospital rotted slowly from the inside, leaving behind scars that would mark the land for decades. The introduction of psychiatric medications in the 1950s, particularly thorazine, revolutionized mental health care. For the first time, symptoms of schizophrenia and other disorders could be managed without the drastic interventions of lobotomies or endless confinement. Patients who might once have been considered uncontrollable could now live in smaller facilities, or even return to their communities. This medical breakthrough coincided with growing public criticism of asylums, fueled by exposés that revealed the horrors within their walls. In Massachusetts, Danvers became a focal point of this debate. Politicians questioned the cost of maintaining such a massive institution, while reformers argued that smaller, community-based care was both more humane and more effective. But as the hospital's population began to shrink, its problems only deepened. By the late 1960s, many wards stood half-empty, their peeling paint and broken fixtures untouched. The reduction in patients did not mean an increase in resources. In fact, funding was cut further, leaving the remaining patients in even more dire conditions. Staff numbers dwindled, morale collapsed, and basic maintenance ceased. The once grand corridors echoed with silence, broken by the occasional shuffle of forgotten patients wandering aimlessly through decaying halls. For those left behind, the promise of deinstitutionalization was hollow. They were not reintegrated into society but abandoned in a collapsing system. The physical decay of Danvers mirrored its moral and institutional decline. Windows were left broken, rain and snow leaking into wards that had once been meticulously maintained. Mold spread across walls, plaster crumbled, and ceilings sagged. Heating systems failed in the brutal Massachusetts winters, leaving patients to shiver in their beds. Insects and vermin found homes in the dark corners of the hospital, feeding on scraps left in uncleaned kitchens. The grand architecture that had once symbolized progress now felt like a mausoleum, the building itself deteriorating as though it could no longer bear the weight of the suffering it contained. By the 1970s, the once bustling hospital had taken on the atmosphere of a ruin even before its official closure. Urban legends began to spread about the asylum. Stories of empty wings where shadows moved, of voices echoing in deserted corridors, of patients who had been left behind when whole wards were shut down. Teenagers from the surrounding towns dared each other to approach the looming structure, whispering about ghosts that roamed the abandoned floors. For many, the hospital was already more a haunted relic than a functioning institution. The official process of closure began in the 1980s, as Massachusetts accelerated its deinstitutionalization policies. Patients were transferred to smaller facilities, nursing homes, or simply discharged into communities ill-prepared to support them. Many ended up homeless, wandering the streets of Boston and nearby towns, their conditions untreated. Families that had once been persuaded to commit their loved ones to Danvers now faced the burden of care alone. The hospital, once touted as the solution to society's mental health crisis, had become part of the problem. By the early 1990s, Danvers State Hospital stood largely empty, its massive wings sealed off, its windows shattered, its grounds overgrown. Vandalism and neglect accelerated the decay. Graffiti covered the walls, furniture was smashed, and files were scattered by trespassers who picked through the remnants of lives once confined there. Nature crept back into the building. Vines snaked across brick walls, roots cracked through floors, and animals nested in the rafters. The asylum had become a ruin in every sense, a place where time itself seemed to rot. For those who ventured inside during these years, the atmosphere was unforgettable. Long corridors stretched into darkness, their silence broken only by the sound of dripping water or the scurry of rats. Medical equipment lay abandoned, rusting in corners. Wheelchairs, gurneys, and restraints left behind like relics of some grotesque museum. Patient records, photographs, and personal effects littered the floors, evidence of the lives once erased within those walls. Some explorers spoke of the overwhelming sense of sorrow that seemed to linger, a heaviness that clung to the air. Others were convinced the hospital was haunted, its spirits unable to rest. The slow death of Danvers became a spectacle in its own right. Paranormal investigators, photographers, and journalists flocked to the site, documenting its decline. Its reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America grew, fueled by stories of apparitions, disembodied voices, and shadowy figures glimpsed in broken windows. Even as the hospital crumbled, it exerted a powerful fascination, its ruinous state amplifying its aura of dread. The asylum on the hill had transitioned from a place of suffering to a place of legend, but the suffering that created that legend remained etched into every brick. By the time demolition crews arrived in the early 2000s to convert the property into apartments, Danvers had already become immortalized in the cultural imagination. Its ruins had inspired films, novels, and even comic books. Yet the destruction of much of the hospital could not erase its legacy. For those who remembered its days as a functioning asylum, the demolition was bittersweet. Some saw it as the necessary end to a place of horror. Others mourned the loss of a historic monument, however dark its history. The hill itself remained, overlooking Massachusetts, its silence as heavy as ever. The abandonment of Danvers is more than the story of a building falling into decay. It is the story of a society turning its back on the very people it had once promised to care for. Deinstitutionalization, though born of good intentions, left thousands adrift, with little support and few resources. The ruin of Danvers became a symbol of that failure, a reminder that progress is meaningless when it is not accompanied by compassion. The crumbling walls testified not only to the decay of a building, but to the collapse of an entire philosophy of care. In the end, Danvers State Hospital did not close with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out whimper. Its decline was marked by silence, neglect, and abandonment, leaving behind nothing but ruins and memories. The hill that had once echoed with the screams and cries of thousands grew quiet, but the shadows of its past never left. Danvers had become a ruin in body, but in spirit, it remained alive, haunting the imaginations of all who gazed upon its towering spires, wondering about the countless lives consumed within. Long before the last patients were discharged, long before the wrecking crews came to demolish its massive wings, Danvers State Hospital had already acquired another, darker reputation. It was haunted. To those who lived in the shadow of its looming spires, the asylum was never simply a building. It was a place of voices and shadows, of whispers carried on the wind, of unseen presences in the night. As the institution decayed, this aura only deepened. The more the walls crumbled, the louder the stories became. Danvers was no longer merely a psychiatric hospital. It was a nexus of ghost stories, paranormal investigations, and a symbol of the restless dead. Accounts of haunting at Danvers began while the hospital was still in operation. Staff spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences in the wards, doors slamming when no one was near, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, sudden cold drafts sweeping through sealed rooms. Nurses on night shifts claimed to see shadowy figures darting across corridors, only to vanish when followed. Some heard voices whispering their names in the dark. In a place filled with so much suffering and death, it was perhaps inevitable that superstition would take root. But at Danvers, the stories refused to fade. As patients died by the thousands and were buried in unmarked graves on the hospital grounds, the sense of a lingering presence grew stronger. Visitors often described an oppressive atmosphere, a heaviness that settled on the chest the moment they crossed the threshold. Some claimed that photographs taken inside the building revealed figures that had not been visible at the time, ghostly silhouettes peering from broken windows or standing in doorways. Even skeptics admitted that the building carried a weight difficult to explain, a sense of accumulated sorrow that clung to its walls like a stain. After its closure in the 1980s and subsequent abandonment, the haunting of Danvers reached new heights. With the wards empty and silence replacing the daily chaos, every creak, every gust of wind, every unexplained sound was magnified. Urban explorers who trespassed into the hospital at night told chilling tales. The sound of children crying in deserted rooms, the faint echo of footsteps following them through the endless corridors, the flicker of lights in wards where electricity had long since been cut off. Some reported being touched or shoved by unseen hands. Others claimed to feel overwhelming waves of sadness or dread, forcing them to flee before they could finish their explorations. The hospital's notoriety soon attracted paranormal investigators from across the country. Danvers became a pilgrimage site for ghost hunters, drawn by its bloody history and reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America. Teams with cameras and recording equipment prowled its corridors, capturing what they claimed were disembodied voices on tape, pleas for help, whispers of names, even screams echoing from nowhere. Photographs revealed strange orbs of light, shadows shaped like human forms, and distortions that defied explanation. While skeptics dismissed much of this as tricks of light or imagination, the sheer number of reports made Danvers stand out even among haunted asylums. The legends were fueled not only by paranormal enthusiasts but also by popular culture. Writers and filmmakers found in Danvers the perfect inspiration for horror. H.P. Lovecraft's fictional Arkham Asylum, later made famous in the Batman universe, was modeled on Danvers, with its Gothic architecture and air of menace. The 2001 psychological horror film Session 9 was filmed on location in the abandoned hospital, cementing its reputation as a place where fiction and reality blurred. In the film, the walls themselves seemed to whisper, driving characters to madness, a theme that echoed the real history of the asylum. For audiences, Danvers became less a hospital than a living character, a presence both terrifying and fascinating. Local folklore added to the mystique. Residents spoke of glowing lights moving through the upper windows long after the hospital was empty, of phantom figures seen crossing the grounds at night, of cries heard on the wind that carried down into town. Children dared each other to approach the gates, whispering about witches, ghosts, and the restless dead who had never left. The cemetery, with its rows of numbered stones, became a focal point of these stories. Visitors described feeling watched as they walked among the graves, as though the nameless dead resented being forgotten. Even those who dismissed the supernatural could not deny the psychological impact of the place. The sheer weight of tragedy embedded in its history seemed to create an atmosphere all its own. Psychologists argue that haunted places often reflect the projection of human fear and grief. Danvers, with its history of abuse, death, and silence, was a perfect canvas for such projections. Yet for those who experienced the building firsthand, the sensations went beyond suggestion. The line between psychology and the paranormal blurred within those walls. In many ways, the haunting of Danvers was inevitable. With thousands of lives lost there, many in pain, despair, or neglect, the hospital became a reservoir of unresolved suffering. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the memory of those lives lingers. Each whisper, each shadow, each unexplained chill serves as a reminder that the past does not easily rest. The legends of Danvers are not merely about spirits, they are about the weight of history itself, pressing against the present, refusing to be buried. By the time demolition began in the early 2000s, Danvers' reputation as a haunted asylum was secure. Paranormal investigators mourned the loss of their playground, but the legends did not die with the building. Stories continued to circulate of strange events on the redeveloped grounds, of residents in the new apartments hearing unexplained noises, of shadows moving in spaces where wards once stood. The land itself seemed marked, as though the suffering of generations could not be erased by bulldozers and fresh paint. Danvers had been a house of horrors in life, and in death it became a ghost of itself, haunting both memory and imagination. The hospital's place in the cultural imagination is unique. Unlike other haunted locations, Danvers combined real historical tragedy with myth, folklore, and art. It became both a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked institutional power and a stage for supernatural storytelling. For many, the haunting is not merely about spirits of the dead but about the ghosts of a failed system, ghosts that remind us of what happens when society abandons its most vulnerable. To walk through Danvers in its final years was to feel surrounded by these ghosts, whether literal or metaphorical. The air seemed thick with sorrow, the walls alive with echoes of the past. Those who entered often spoke of being changed, as though the hospital had imprinted itself upon them. Even today, long after much of the building has been destroyed, Danvers remains one of America's most famous haunted sites. Its reputation endures, not just because of tales of apparitions, but because it embodies the truth at the heart of every ghost story, that suffering leaves marks, and that some places can never truly be at peace. The story of Danvers State Hospital is not merely one of a single institution. It is a mirror held up to the broader failures and contradictions of how America has historically treated its most vulnerable. To speak of Danvers is to speak of a society caught between compassion and cruelty, between progress and exploitation, between the lofty ideals of reformers and the harsh realities of institutionalization. The hospital's legacy forces us to ask difficult questions about what it means to heal, what it means to punish, and where the line between the two has so often been blurred. The origins of Danvers were steeped in optimism. Reformers like Dorothea Dix believed that the mentally ill deserved dignity and care, not abandonment in jails or almshouses. The Kirkbride Plan was hailed as enlightened, an architectural philosophy that fused environment with healing. At its core, this movement reflected a deep cultural desire to impose order on chaos, to find solutions for conditions that terrified the public. Yet even at its inception, the asylum model carried the seeds of failure. By removing the mentally ill from society, it sought not only to treat them but to hide them, to sweep them out of sight. The impulse to help was mixed with the impulse to exile, and in that contradiction lay the foundations of tragedy. Danvers revealed the inherent flaw in relying on massive institutions to provide individualized care. No matter how noble the intent, the sheer scale of the hospital transformed people into numbers. Doctors could not know their patients intimately. Attendants could not provide compassion when they were outnumbered 50-1. The system, overwhelmed by overcrowding and underfunding, relied on control rather than care. Restraints, sedation, and punishment replaced therapy. The asylum became a machine, one that ground down the individuals trapped inside until their identities were erased. The ghosts of Danvers are not supernatural. They are the echoes of people consumed by a system too large to see them as human. The medical practices at Danvers highlight another uncomfortable truth, that progress in science often comes at terrible cost. Each new treatment was hailed as a breakthrough: hydrotherapy, electroshock, insulin coma therapy, lobotomy, only to be revealed later as brutal, ineffective, or outright destructive. Patients at Danvers were subjected to these experiments without consent, their suffering justified as sacrifice for the advancement of knowledge. It is easy, in hindsight, to condemn the doctors and administrators who allowed such cruelty. But the real lesson lies deeper. Desperation for solutions, combined with blind faith in authority, can create horrors cloaked as healing. Danvers is a warning of what happens when science is pursued without humanity. The silence that surrounded Danvers also speaks volumes. Families surrendered their loved ones, often never to see them again, and accepted the hospital's reassurances that treatment was underway. Society tolerated the abuses because it preferred not to confront the uncomfortable reality of mental illness. The hospital's imposing facade allowed people to imagine that care was being provided, even as neglect festered within. The lesson here is not only about institutions but about the collective willingness to look away. Danvers thrived in shadows because the public permitted it to, comforted by the illusion that suffering had been contained behind locked doors. The eventual decline of Danvers during the deinstitutionalization era revealed yet another failure. Asylums like Danvers were shuttered in the name of reform, but the promised alternative, community-based care, was never adequately funded or supported. Thousands of patients, once confined in places like Danvers, were released into a world unprepared to help them. Many ended up homeless, incarcerated, or lost to the margins of society. The cycle of abandonment continued, only in a different form. Danvers teaches us that closing an institution is not enough. True reform requires investment, empathy, and sustained commitment to treating the mentally ill as full members of society. The haunting of Danvers, both literal and metaphorical, reflects this unresolved guilt. Ghost stories flourish where the past has been ignored or denied. The tales of shadows in corridors and voices in the night are more than superstition. They are cultural expressions of the truth we prefer not to confront. The patients who died nameless in numbered graves, the families who never received closure, the generations scarred by the stigma of mental illness, all linger in the collective memory. The lesson here is clear. When suffering is hidden, it does not disappear. It festers, it haunts, it demands to be remembered. There is also a lesson in the architecture itself. The Kirkbride plan was based on the belief that environment could shape recovery, that sunlight, air, and beauty could heal the mind. While the plan ultimately failed under the pressures of overcrowding, it contains a kernel of truth. Environment matters. The spaces we build reflect the values we hold. At Danvers, the grand design became a prison, its towering spires oppressive rather than inspiring. But its very existence reminds us that the way we shape our institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons, reveals how we view the people inside them. Danvers teaches us that when we build places to hide people away, we are not solving problems, we are burying them alive. On a broader scale, Danvers is a story about power. Those committed to the hospital had little say in their fate. Diagnoses were vague, commitments were often indefinite, and consent was rarely sought. The mentally ill became subjects of a system that decided their lives without their input. This imbalance of power remains a central issue in mental health care today. The lesson is that care without autonomy is not truly care. Treatment must be collaborative, respectful, and centered on the humanity of the patient, or it risks repeating the same patterns of domination and silencing. In remembering Danvers, we are forced to confront not only the mistakes of the past but the dangers of the present. Modern psychiatric care has advanced enormously, but the temptations remain: to reduce people to diagnoses, to prioritize control over compassion, to embrace quick fixes over long-term investment. The legacy of Danvers warns us that without vigilance, progress can turn to cruelty. The ghosts of Danvers are reminders, urging us not to forget that those who suffer are not problems to be solved but people to be seen. Perhaps the most profound lesson of all is this: the history of Danvers is not an aberration, but a reflection of society's ongoing struggle with mental illness. The institution's rise and fall chart the shifting tides of how we understand the human mind. At times hopeful, at times brutal, always incomplete. By looking at Danvers, we see the best and worst of ourselves, our capacity for compassion, our hunger for order, our fear of the unknown, and our tendency to sacrifice individuals for the illusion of progress. In the end, Danvers State Hospital forces us to ask, what does it mean to heal? Is it the silencing of symptoms, no matter the cost, or is it the restoration of dignity, identity, and connection? The hospital's history offers a stark answer. Healing cannot come from walls of stone, from restraints, or from knives cutting into brains. It comes from recognizing the humanity of those who suffer, from refusing to hide them away, from ensuring that their voices are not lost in silence. Danvers failed in this mission. Its ruins remain as a reminder of what happens when we forget. The hill where Danvers State Hospital once stood still watches over the towns below, its silence carrying the weight of everything that happened there. The Gothic towers are mostly gone now, demolished in the early 2000s to make way for condominiums and modern development, but the land itself remembers. For more than a century, those walls contain the stories of thousands of men, women, and children whose voices were silenced, their lives consumed by a system that promised care but delivered suffering. The demolition may have erased the physical structure, but it could not erase the shadow of what Danvers became. Walking the grounds today, it is difficult to imagine the scale of the institution that once dominated the hill. Apartments now occupy spaces where wards once overflowed with patients. Manicured lawns cover the ground where bodies were carried out under sheets to be buried in numbered graves. The central clock tower, partially preserved as a gesture to history, stands as the last sentinel of a place that was both sanctuary and prison, hope and horror. Residents of the new development speak of the strange quiet that settles over the hill at night, as though the ground itself resists forgetting. The closure of Danvers did not bring closure to the story. Families still search for records of relatives who disappeared into its wards, their final resting places never confirmed. Advocates for mental health reform continue to invoke the asylum as a warning, a symbol of what happens when care becomes confinement. Paranormal investigators still visit, convinced that the spirits of patients linger in the soil, their suffering too great to release. In this way, Danvers remains alive, less a building than an idea, a reminder that the line between progress and nightmare is far thinner than we like to believe. The lessons of Danvers are heavy, but they are necessary. They remind us that good intentions are not enough. The reformers of the 19th century believed they were building a place of healing, guided by science and compassion. Yet within decades, that vision collapsed under overcrowding, neglect, and cruelty. The treatments that followed, shocks, comas, lobotomies, were carried out in the name of medicine, yet inflicted irreparable harm. The lesson is that without accountability, empathy, and vigilance, institutions can quickly become instruments of suffering. And yet, Danvers is not only a story of cruelty, it is also a story of memory. Every ghost story told, every photograph taken, every whispered legend ensures that the people who lived and died there are not entirely forgotten. The horror of Danvers resonates precisely because it is human. Behind every number in the cemetery was a person with a name, a story, a family. Behind every treatment gone wrong was a life altered forever. The true haunting of Danvers is not found in flickering lights or shadowy figures, but in the silence of those lost voices. To remember them is to acknowledge their humanity, denied to them in life but restored in memory. Culturally, Danvers has achieved an almost mythic status. It inspired H.P. Lovecraft's Arkham Asylum, cementing its influence in Gothic horror and pop culture. It was immortalized in the film Session 9, where the building itself seemed to breathe malevolence. It has been written about, photographed, investigated, and whispered about for decades. But beneath the layers of fiction lies a deeper truth. The fascination with Danvers endures because it represents real suffering. Its legend grips us because it forces us to confront the darkest aspects of how society has treated those it deems other. The ghosts of Danvers are metaphors as much as they are apparitions, symbols of our collective guilt. As we reflect on Danvers, it is impossible not to wonder what remains on that hill. Are the whispers of patience still echoing through the soil? Are the restless dead pacing the grounds, unwilling to leave? Or is the haunting something more abstract, the presence of memory itself, lingering because it demands to be acknowledged? Perhaps the land is not haunted by spirits, but by history, a history that refuses to be paved over or demolished, a history that insists on being told again and again. For those who gaze upon the hill today, there is an undeniable eeriness. The apartments may be new, but the ground beneath them is old, marked by generations of suffering. Some residents report strange occurrences, footsteps in empty halls, whispers at night, cold drafts in sealed rooms. Others simply describe an atmosphere, a heaviness that cannot be explained. Whether supernatural or psychological, these sensations speak to the same truth. Danvers has not gone quietly into history. Its presence lingers, shaping the lives of those who now occupy its space. In the end, Danvers is more than a hospital, more than a ruin, more than a ghost story. It is a monument to the complexities of human nature, our desire to heal, our capacity for cruelty, our fear of difference, and our ability to forget. It is a reminder that progress is fragile, that without compassion, science can become a weapon, and that the voices of the vulnerable must never be silenced. Danvers demands that we remember, Not only the architecture, not only the scandals, but the people. It asks us to confront our history honestly, however uncomfortable, and to ensure that such suffering is never repeated. The hill still watches. Its silence is not empty, but filled with echoes. The wind that sweeps across its slopes carries the whispers of the forgotten, reminders of promises broken and lives lost. The story of Danvers State Hospital is not finished, for it continues to live on in memory, in legend, in the very soil of Massachusetts. To tell this story is to keep those voices alive, to acknowledge that even in ruins, the past is never truly gone. And so, as the sun sets behind the preserved clock tower and the shadows lengthen across the hill, one truth remains. Danvers may be gone, but its ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, will never rest. The hill still watches, and it always will.